start. So, Lou, you can start, please.
All right, I'll start. Here we go. Just a second here. All right, I'm going to leave it in this form so that I can point at it. All right, so the title of this short talk is, what is a structure that it can appear in contradictory forms to an observer? And what is an observer that she can abide with such a structure? And you seem to be looking at such a structure here. I expect that I'm not saying anything in this talk that you don't already know, but I'm putting together some ideas in relation to perceptions, multiple perceptions that are visual, not because the talk is about visual perception, but because that gives us a class of examples from which we might generalize. So this is my first example, of course. And if you were to cover up one of the ends of this, then you realize that the perception of 3 or the perception of 4 extends all the way out as far as it can, with no contradiction. You might have thought, on looking at this to begin with, that the story is that over here people see 4 and over here people see 3, and in the middle there's some kind of confusion. Perhaps you thought there was confusion in the middle, but that's not so. The confusion came from the collision of viewpoints occurred at the very ends. The viewpoints spread outward from their locales and would encompass the entire space if they could. The viewpoints spread outward. Now, you can take a viewpoint about viewpoints via elementary catastrophe theory, and I think that image is worth thinking about. In that image, a viewpoint is like being caught in the bottom of a well. And then it may be that the context around your viewpoint changes, and changes in such a way that other viewpoints are possible, but you're still caught in the well. And it may be that the context would change so much that you would quite easily and quickly roll into the other viewpoint. But that may or may not happen. And that depends on the landscape in which the situation occurs. And this is diagrammed in the catastrophe theory, which will look at landscapes of situations like that by looking at geometric pictures that contain all the different possibilities. So if you hadn't seen this before or hadn't thought about it in a while, it's worth looking at the simplest one, which is the cusp catastrophe, which is a bit of cloth folded so that when you look at it here, there is the upper layer and the lower layer, and you're not so likely, if you're in the middle, to change layers. But if you're pushed all the way to the edge, which is like being here, then you may transit to the other layer. And then you could be pushed along until the opposite happened and you rolled into the other layer at the other end. And these are the extremes, but it may also be the case that the landscape would change in such a way that the distinctions that are happening because of sitting in these wells become eradicated, and things are on a more or less level plane, and one could easily slide from one situation to the other. So this is a point of view about the structure of context, which is worth thinking about, and the elementary geometry of this is worth thinking about. So as I said in my slide, you can think of a viewpoint as analogous to being trapped in a well, and a continuous transition from one viewpoint to another is possible if the shape of the well can change. Or it may be a very long journey going a long journey, holding a certain viewpoint until suddenly you're at a point where you can make the transition to the other viewpoint. The landscape can provide larger possibilities for that change. On the other hand, the landscape of transition from one point of view to another can be quite hidden from the observer, as we see in these kind of examples. You make the transitions back and forth between the front cube, back cube in the Necker cube, or faces and vase, but you have no access to how that happens, or you have little access to how that happens. Or you can explore how to influence it, but you don't have a picture of the way the context changes. And you understand how in ordinary life forces are there holding you in one context or another, so that we can have a viewpoint which is quite coherent but entirely imaginary. The construct coming out of that viewpoint appears to inhabit our ordinary space, as in these Gestalt examples, where you see here a triangle, but it's not there. And here, remarkably, you see a three-dimensional sphere, which isn't there, or a snake that isn't there, or who knows what this is that isn't there. Hints and the contexts in which you live provide you with these illusory wholes. And this goes on all the time. I'm meaning for you, as I do these abstract examples, to think of everyday examples, such as the points of view we take about one political situation or another, and the different points of view that people have in those situations. It's all the same. These are just, principally, it's all the same. These examples underline how we work. We can have a viewpoint quite coherent that is entirely imaginary. The construct appears to inhabit our ordinary space. I said that before, but in these cases, the imaginary object is an imagined object of an ordinary kind. Here, the imaginary object is right in front of you, quite coherent, but it doesn't really exist in ordinary space. Are you asking a question? No, okay. The construct appears to inhabit our ordinary space, but it isn't. It's a purely imaginary construct. And by special acts of perception, you may be able to see the source of the illusion that generates the imaginary object. I occluded part of the triangle, and you see that what you might say is really happening on the rest of it is something that could have been in three space. Perfectly nice picture of some logs going along, but they don't touch one another at that vertex. So that's the source of the difficulty, eh? But if you included it elsewhere, then there's no problem here. And it's a different embedding in three space. And here, yet a different one. And yet, by special acts of perception, we may be able to see the source of the illusion that generates the object, but these scientific acts do not erase our direct experience of the imaginary as real. And this is our situation with all of our perceptions. They're all like this. We find them coherent, but if we look at them scientifically, we find out all sorts of things about them that have nothing to do with the direct perception. They have something to do with it, but the direct perception goes beyond that into a coherence that we have constructed. A coherence that may be the coherence of your allegiance to a government or a person or any number of things which seems utterly coherent And yet, when you apply scientific investigation to it, is found to be wrong, contradictory, whatever. The local to global influence can help us to construct apparently real global structures that are logically contradictory. The Gestalt trumps logic. And logic is trumped in all of these situations by the need or happening of that coherence that we look for. And of course, everything is happening through frameworks, but it's very surprising to look at examples of how different frameworks give you different perceptions of the quote, same thing. This example is one of my favorites. On the left, you have some flat patterns. On the right, with a different framework, you see a cube three-dimensional. You see a cube three-dimensional by filling in the rest of it, of course, but it's the framework. The framework is a lens by which you construct the world. So there are many related ideas here if you start to think about it. There's the relation of particle, local, and field, global, I meant to say global. There are field effects, and the facts from field theory, if you think about them, such as electromagnetic induction and waves and so on, are all relevant for thinking about how points of view influence one another. There is the non-locality of topological influence. There's notions of form and eigenform and how forms come about through our participation and recursion. There's pervasive non-locality in that every one of us is influencing every other one of us, or even at the quantum level. And there are the relationships of recursion and influence and dynamic stability. So there's large numbers of ideas that are related to the ideas that I'm indicating here. And the principles that we've indicated here about the possibility of change of viewpoint and relation of viewpoint and stability of viewpoint and persistence of the imaginary are of wide applicability. If one reflects on how our opinions about what is going on in the world, quotes, operate, we see that again and again the principles shown here are working in the background. At the very least, we need to understand that the notion that the world is everything that is the case has to be examined to see how what is the case has come about and how it's changing and what background it has arisen and where the possibility for flexibility lies. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, it's just 16 minutes. So you have plenty of time to raise questions. Jonathan, you are muted.
Am I?
I would like.
Oh, now we hear you.
Where can I read more about this?
What is the this that you're asking about? If it's about perception in relation to these sorts of things, then you might read psychologists like Kurt Lewin who talk about field effects in relation to viewpoint or Gestalt psychology. Well, or you might read cyberneticists who talk about eigenform and eigenstate.
I'm a neuropsychiatrist who went to school in the prehistoric ages and studied mathematics, graduating in 1966. Jacobson was there, and I knew a little bit about topology at that time, but I have not kept up on the vast importance of topology in materials science. And I'm very interested in that now, since I'm trying to describe cytoplasm and the dense construction of matter in cells and macromolecules. To refresh relevant topology that is now relevant to all kinds of things. I'm realizing I was not aware of how topology is so significant in materials, but also in understanding everything, really, and understanding quantum issues and
I see. So your question is about applied topology, as it were. Yeah.
I guess
Um,
I mean I'm
and
really learning, just really groping in this area. It's new. I did study the math, but I think it was just beginning at that point. Was it in 1966? Topology was not.
Topology is a field that's been around for a long time. It's about plastic geometry, right? It's about things like
Right.
surfaces where you can bend them, or knots where you can move them around, um, and higher dimensional and lower dimensional versions of things like that. And of course, there's lots of flexible structures out there in the scientific world, like long chain molecules. DNA is a long chain molecule. So there are a lot of topology going on. And also people try to understand qualitatively, what does some data look like, right? You have a cloud of data, and if you looked at it with your eyes, you might see that, oh, it's spherical, or it's all tree-like branching, forms. So how do you measure data in relation to its shape? How do you get at the shape of something? So indeed, there is a lot of nowadays applied topology, in the sense that people figure out ways to compute things about shape and so on.
And that
And
merges.
I can give you some references about that if you want to
Yes.
write me an email.
Okay. Do we?
Gary?
Mark,
Let me put my email into the chat line, just in case you don't have it.
I'm new here. I'm brought here by Mark, and I'm totally new in
Oops.
this group. I don't really know. I know Torde, but I don't know.
Jerry, you raised the hand.
Now, the import of what I was talking about was as metaphor for thinking about points of view more generally, like 4 and 3, but Palestinian or Israeli at the two ends of the thing. All sorts of points of view that adhere to different human groups and in the world. So that someone might say, well, he's being very abstract and he isn't talking about what we'd really like to hear about. But I'm on the one hand deliberately staying away from saying anything political about U.S. politics or international politics, and on the other hand, saying that all of the perceptual principles that you find happening about the way different points of view come about are applicable to all of these situations that we're very concerned about. Um, so that was the intent here, but there is also, of course, a subtext with me about topology and how topology can be used in a lot of different situations. So I'd be very happy to talk with you separately about that, and if you send me an email, I'll try to get you some references that would be
That's
useful.
very kind of you. I'm also interested in how it relates to complexity theory, because it clearly does now, and that's a whole huge area that I'm just beginning to realize.
Peter.
Thank you, as ever. That was the most concise and brilliant piece of explanation about this topic that I think I've ever heard. And two things come to mind. One, my interest is in systems literacy. And I wonder how your presentation could be more widely spread to students of all ages.
Well, at least talking to the Congress people.
Well, talking
to students.
Exactly. I mean, talking to everyone, really, because I mean, it is the essence of understanding our relation to each other and to the world, and it's a wonderful I was going to say, simple introduction to the complex topic of meta awareness, in a sense. So that's sort of an observation and a thanks, and a kind of I guess a question out there to all of us is how do we spread the word, as it were. One thing you said, which I just want to ask you about, Gestalt trumps logic. And now, if Gestalt is the whole, and we're talking about systems literacy, is there a fallacy or something that one has to be aware of, that the whole understanding Gestalt, or is the Gestalt the same as the whole, and is holism the same as Gestalt, and then do we find ourselves in a trap of some kind?
Well, we find ourselves in a trap of some kind indeed. The world that's presented to us may not be exactly the same as what we're going to find out as we start investigating it. We know this perfectly well, right? And we walk around thinking the sun is going around the earth. We still feel like the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening.
I know.
After all that.
Exactly.
Jerry?
Yeah, I think a very, very nice presentation that brings all of Renee Tome's various writings into perspective. And these writings had a great influence on me back in the 60s. And so I appreciate the summary and overview that you've given. However, subsequent to the 60s, I've pushed further, and as you recall, I'm a biochemist by training, into the relationship of these visual illusions with particularly symbolic logic. And do you have an explanation or a way that you interpret symbolic logic of these figures?
Well, let's take the Necker cube, right? The Necker cube implies the Necker cube has two states. Let's call them front and back. Yeah. So front gives rise to back, and back gives rise to front, right? If you're in the front state, it's unstable and it gives rise to the back state, and vice versa. So, so this is similar to a liar paradox of the kind on the other side of this card is false. The statement on the other side of this card is false, kind of thing, which keeps flipping you back and forth. So one way of modeling, in a very crude way, these multi-stable perceptions is with multi-stable logical states, paradoxes, self-reference in symbolic logic. So that's one level. Another level would be to go to the scanning that we do, because we have made some hypothesis about one part of the cube is front. And that means that we have decided that certain local parts of it are in a certain form, which are not given. We've imagined it one way. But as soon as we imagine one of them the other way, then it tends to be the case that another one will follow. And this is related to that other perceptual principle that I was talking about of a point of view wants to spread. So I do think you can think of modeling those kind of perceptual switches in terms of points of view spreading. You've held a point of view, but it's like holding too much, and if your point of view slips into the other one, then that spreads and the thing goes the other way. But I don't know about that, because all of that doesn't happen in your consciousness, does it? You just tend to see the cube one way and then you see it another way. You don't watch it slowly changing from one to the other.
Okay, I grasp the semantics that you're using there to try and bridge the gap between the conjunctive nature of the figures and the disjunctive natures of the figures. And those are the
Yeah, that's
symbolic.
right. That's right. Right.
Okay, so those are the
Mhm.
symbolic logic forms that I was thinking of. And I think there's more
Yeah.
to this than that, because these,
Oh, I think there's a lot more to it than that.
okay.
Right. And
So
and
one of the
if you
things
go
that
over
are
to the
important.
let me say another thing. In
Sure.
logic, of course, back around 1905 or whenever it was when Russell articulated his paradox, a Necker cube appeared in logic, namely Russell set, right? Russell set looks like it belongs to itself, but as soon as you say it does and look at what that means, it doesn't belong to itself. It flips. And then, given that it doesn't belong to itself and you do your mathematical perception, it has to belong to itself. So it keeps going back and forth. But it wasn't taken as an interesting imaginary object to deal with at the time. It was regarded as something that we'd better get rid of this thing. Yeah, but I think by now we understand that objects like that have to be placed in some context to understand them. At least cybernetics people understand that these are not necessarily to be avoided. These are actually structures which are related to what we do and how we proceed. But it's still also the case that in the logical system situation, the logicians, we are still involved in writing down systems that would keep the bad items out of the system. So we haven't the community as a whole is still a bit polarized about such things, which is again a matter of two viewpoints.
John has a question.
Let me, I have one more question, if I could, Jason.
Oh, okay.
The problem that I'm trying to address sort of from a backsided way here is the basic incoherence of parts of mathematics. And within this symbolic logic issues that underlie the incoherence of mathematics when it comes to living systems. And
what do you mean
this
by
part,
incoherence?
let
Do you
me
mean
finish.
that the mathematics doesn't model the systems very well?
Well, I think it goes a little deeper than that. But the real question I wanted to bring to your, since you do much work in physics, is how do you relate these forms of visualization to the natural, so-called natural constants of physics, which are not really very closely related to number theory, if I can put it mildly. And I bring this in the context of the natural nature of the atomic numbers. And so that if you just compose atomic numbers, you will always get new numbers. And so they have a certain sense
I mean,
of
some
constants
constants of fit. Let's slow it down a moment. There are
Okay.
some constants in physics, like say this fine structure constant, which comes from experiment. And nobody has a good theoretical explanation for the fine structure constant. It doesn't drop out of anybody's theory. Other mathematical constants have a perfectly good understanding in terms of geometry, like pi, right? The ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter or its radius. So things like that we understand, but we have no theoretical understanding of certain physical constants. I don't know that this is an incoherence in mathematics. It's just a whole. Our theories don't explain everything.
I do agree with you. It's really a very sharp gap in our understanding of nature. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, you might imagine a great theory of nature would start from almost nothing, and all the numbers that happen in it would be built up out of the theory. The standard model is the exact opposite. We have a wonderful theory, and all sorts of numbers have to be introduced just so in order to make it work. It's not satisfactory.
John?
Thanks, Lou, for that talk. It's great. I'd like to suggest that consciousness trumps both Gestalt and logic. So I think what you're talking about is the nature of consciousness, which I've written many papers and books about. So
Yeah, of course, I agree with you. When I say Gestalt, that's a mixture of consciousness and your experience, of course.
I'm just trying to get my foot in the door here.
Yeah.
So my take on what you're saying is I've invoked Lynn Margulis's symbiogenesis hypothesis theory now, that basically we assimilate factors in the environment that pose existential threats. And in so doing, within species, there's much less variability than between species. But what you're looking at, in my opinion, is a difference in the way that different members of a species see the same thing. It's not a different number base, but there is variability as a function of survival of so my take on consciousness is it's derived from our physiology. And I've shown recently that if you put differentiated cells in zero gravity, they lose their identity. So clearly, the gravitational force was what induced life, all life. And therefore, there's this a fundamental connection between, and I also invoke the idea of quantum entanglement as the basis for that. So there's a fundamental relationship there between physics and biology, which we have not yet really invoked. And I think it's an important way to understand what you're talking about, but you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I would also refer to Varela and Maturana in there talking about how organisms each build their own worlds. And those worlds are built out of the autonomy, the autonomy of the organism itself is helping to create the sense of world that given organism has.
Yeah, the problem with Maturana and Varela, in my opinion, is they described what I'm talking about. They did not provide a mechanism in order to be able to be testable and refutable. I mean, I'm a scientist, I'm an empiricist. So that's why I say, I mean, it's important that we have a model which actually provides causation. It's nice to describe, but it goes far beyond that. And in fact, I've suggested.
So your point of view is that one should take seriously the full findings of modern physics and natural science, and try to understand how our consciousness and viewpoints are related to what we know about that. I agree.
Yes, right, absolutely. So thanks.
David, you have good questions in chat box. Can you relay those to us? David, Pinto? I mean, you have nice questions there. Yeah. So tell us what's in your mind.
It's lovely to hear. All right, Lewis. Is it Lewis or Lou?
Lou.
Lou, it's lovely to hear your observations and the amount of knowledge behind those few observations that you've made. Okay. I don't have the skill to verbalize as well as you. I don't have the ability. I can hear and I can do maths, and I can engage people socially. I am against the notion of any kind of physical reductivity. We have a tendency to do that. And we also tend to use mathematics that is also spatially orientated, i.e. a physical reductive aspect to it. So I would like to ask you, I guess, actually this is the question I suppose that's popped into my head, is can we mathematize, for example, our psychosocial engagement here? And if we can produce some kind of relatively simple mathematics that somehow or other captures relatively closely some aspect of our psychosocial engagement, then that's the kind of thing that I think we can, publicize and put out there and so on and so forth. But we need to have something simple because everybody's using Zoom. And instead of treating it as an object of thought, we need some kind of mathematics which reflects us in what we're doing.
Well, when you speak of, people often say we would like to have mathematics that does this or that. And mathematics per se means that you have some set of assumptions that you put forth, and that you will then look at the skein of relationships among them and deductions that you can make from them. That's what a mathematics is. So,
wait a second. Okay, sorry. No, look, I love what you're doing. Okay, I love it. Okay, it's just we seem to be driving down into a dead end, it seems. Okay, so there's a guy called, oh God, I've used his term. Okay, it's like 3 types of mathematician or mathematics. You've got the Platonic maths, which is somehow rather relevant to physical reality, you know, cubes and so on and so forth, Platonic solids. You've got mathematics, which is formal, which is just what you're talking about, assumptions, rules of transformation of rules. Okay, that's formal mathematics or abstract maths. But then there's a third type, which is the mind that's required to do the maths, which I think is what John's kind of saying.
Well,
okay?
mathematics is done by, mathematics is something that's done by minds. But when you say, I wish to have a mathematics, you are saying that you wish to have a language currency that can be exchanged between people that they call mathematics. And when you have a language currency that is called mathematics, that means that you have some symbolic system with assumptions that you can use.
Right.
It isn't just assumptions, it has to do with the use of the symbols as well, because that's very important. For example, think of the evolution of arithmetic, where we finally got to Arabic numeration, which allows us to have a highly powerful common mathematics. The mathematics is operated by minds, and it is working with our minds. But when you ask for mathematics, that's what you're asking for.
Wait a second. Right. So, sorry. I'll just
this
keep
is
everybody's
for
attention just for 1 second.
You understand what we're doing? You're at 4, I'm at 3.
Say that again.
We're looking at something in 2 different ways. You say 4, I say 3. We're doing that.
Okay,
we're doing that conflict. I don't fully understand your point of view. I'm asking you about it, and I'm telling you mine.
I know. All right. So if it's possible for us, okay, I would like to say that mathematics is biased towards the representational physical reality. You know, literally 1, 2, 3, counting things. Okay. And so therefore,
can you give me, yes, so can you give me an example of a mathematics? I can give you examples of mathematics that do not seem to be that biased. They're in the direction of logic or algebra, but it's true. Most of the mathematics that we have evolved came from our experiences with physical reality. This is true.
Okay, and I'm suggesting that it kind of does that kind of mapping. It tends to do that, and that's science. Okay, but there is a formal mathematics where, you know, and you've shown some diagrams that don't represent physical reality. You know, they don't.
Well, of course. I mean, us pure mathematicians have a tendency to say the mathematics is best when it has nothing to do with physical reality. You know, that's the ivory tower point of view, right?
I just want to propose that if we keep on doing this as an object of our attention and using mathematics, for example, to do with perception, biases our interpretation of this maths as being about something, i.e. a physical reality. Whereas I'm suggesting, and other people have suggested, including Deleuze and Guattari, okay, you know, postmodern philosophers, that it's to do with us, us looking at the maths. So the given is that we are looking at this, we are thinking about this, and therefore it's not in the maths, it's not about something else, it reflects us.
Right.
It reflects us. That's a different way of using maths.
But you see, you have to get hold of what kind of math would you like to look at here. For example, I think you would like to look at category theory, because in category theory, no, you wouldn't like to look at category theory. That's not the kind of math you like.
No, that wouldn't be.
Honestly,
think topology.
Can you give me an example of a mathematics that fits your bill?
John
A
has the
Small
last
example,
question.
any example.
I teach
Uh,
kids maths.
I'd like to
Gi-
chip
Give
in
him,
here.
give
and
him time for a
suggest that-
moment, Jason, to
Okay.
clarify. Well,
Okay.
can you give me an example of a mathematics that fits your bill?
Yeah, so when I teach maths, look, I did social anthropology, okay, and I teach maths. Okay, I was meant to do pure maths.
Yeah,
I've been
yeah.
interested in systems and psychology. I've been interested in math. How do you mathematize our psychosocial existence? Okay, that's what I've been interested
Okay,
in
good,
all my life.
good.
So when I'm teaching kids, instead of going, these are negative numbers, these are fractions, and I'm talking about adolescents, okay? So they've been through the system. And there I am showing them negative numbers, and then they say something in response, and I go, what does that mean? What is going on in their mind for them to be understanding any of this? Not so much, here's the definitive interpretation of what algebra is or negative numbers. What have they already got in their minds naturally for them to
Yeah,
even...
I couldn't agree with you more. So that so that in the working of mathematics with someone else or the teaching, we're in a dialogue, and we're really interested. We're maybe as a teacher, you're more interested in finding out what kind of idea did they have about what came up than what idea you had to begin with. Surely.
Yes, and it's
For
not
the sake
even...
of time,
And
for the sake of
and if
time,
I'm creating, let me finish the one comment. If I'm creating some mathematics, I'm dialoguing with myself and others, and we want to see what's happening, what's going to come up, right? It isn't something that's given beforehand. We're playing out at the boundaries of something, and we want to see what might happen, what will happen, and what happens depends on our consciousness. It depends on our dialogue. It depends on our interchange. It depends on what we ate this morning. It depends on the politics in the world. It's not isolated.
John has the last question for Luke.
Just a comment, Lou. Yeah. So when I mentioned symbiogenesis, that was key because that merged observer and observed. And in my opinion, you're not mathematics. The circle, which is the key to not mathematics, is the same as a cell in 3 dimensions. And so there's a confluence of the biology and the mathematics, which is a consequence of the merging of the physical and the biologic. So I've contended in a paper I published that there was no consciousness until the topology of the cell existed, and there was an inside and an outside. So in my opinion, for example, Gödel's incompleteness theory, a theorem is because consciousness is not included in his analysis. It's outside of his analysis. Once you merge the consciousness with the mathematics, you have a complete mathematics. Comment.
Yeah, you're right. Gödel's theorem is proved by saying, suppose I have a formal system. That means consciousness is excluded. It's just machine-like. And then we'll prove something about its limitations. So we're finding out that systems without consciousness have certain limitations that we don't.
Well, yeah, especially AI, because it doesn't account for the emergence of the non-local consciousness. It only accounts for local consciousness. That's a huge problem, in my opinion.
Could you, in one sentence, say what you mean by symbiogenesis?
Oh, that was Lynn Margulis's idea, which he first published in 1967. It was she hypothesized that bacteria were the source of mitochondria. So a eukaryotic form, a cell, assimilated a bacterium, and that's where mitochondria emerged from. But there's a whole litany of evidence. It's not just bacteria, it's every component of our physiology, beginning with unicellular organisms, that has been created by this assimilation of the environment, factors of the environment that are proposed for existence of threats.